My name is Rachel Moore. I'm 31 years old, and for 5 years I believed I had finally earned my place in my family. I believed that because when bills piled up, they called me. When the hospital asked for deposits, I paid them. When my parents whispered late at night about money, I was the solution they never had to say out loud. And on the night of my father's 63rd birthday, sitting under warm restaurant lights after his heart surgery, I thought finally we were celebrating survival, gratitude, family. Instead, my mother leaned forward at that table, looked directly at me, and said something I still hear in my sleep. "You're not really part of this family. Not shouted, not drunk, not accidental." One sentence spoken calmly in front of my father, my sister, my younger brother, undid 5 years of sacrifice. In that moment, everything I thought I understood about loyalty, love, and belonging collapsed. And for the first time in my adult life, I stopped trying to fix it. Because what I said next didn't start an argument. It ended something. Before we go any further, if this story resonates with you, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you're watching from somewhere across the country or the world, leave a comment letting me know where you are and what time it is there. I hope this story keeps you company tonight, especially if you're watching from a quiet living room, a kitchen table, or a place where memories feel heavier than usual. I'm glad you're here. I grew up knowing exactly where I stood in my family, even if no one ever said it out loud. I was the middle child, not the first miracle, not the last baby, just the one in between. My older sister Emily was everything my mother admired. She married young, had children quickly, and fit neatly into the life my mother believed a daughter should want. My younger brother Jason was the one everyone worried about, the one who needed help, patience, second chances. Their love for him was loud and protective. Mine was conditional, quiet, earned in pieces. From the time I was young, I learned that attention came when I was useful, when I didn't make trouble, when I solved problems before anyone had to ask. If Emily needed help with homework, I helped. If Jason forgot something at school, I ran it over. I watched my mother praise them openly while offering me approval in smaller doses, usually followed by a comparison. Rachel is smart, but Emily has better instincts. Rachel is responsible, but Jason has more heart. I learned not to react. Not reacting made me easier to live with. By the time I was in high school, the pattern was set. Emily's milestones were celebrated. Jason's mistakes were excused. And I became the one who had it together. I didn't ask for rides. I didn't ask for money. I didn't ask for reassurance. I told myself I didn't need it. I told myself independence was strength. What I didn't realize then was that I was training myself to disappear. Things shifted when I was 16 and the household finances started to fracture. My father's work became inconsistent. Bills appeared on the kitchen counter more often. Conversations lowered into whispers after dinner. I noticed how my mother's mood followed the mail. I noticed how stress changed the air in the house. And somewhere between algebra homework and late-night studying, I made a quiet decision I would never be the reason this family struggled again. That was the year I started thinking in numbers instead of feelings. Budgets made sense to me. Equations had answers. Money, I believed, could fix what emotions couldn't. I chose finance not because I loved it, but because it felt like control. Because it felt like armor. If I could earn enough, plan well enough, anticipate enough, then maybe I could finally relax. Maybe then I would belong. I worked harder than anyone noticed. I stayed late. I skipped things. I learned how to succeed without needing praise because I wasn't sure it would ever come. And when I succeeded, the acknowledgement was brief. Useful. Expected. Rachel will be fine, my mother liked to say. She always is. Looking back now, that sentence explains everything. Being fine meant I wasn't protected. Being capable meant I wasn't cared for. And I absorbed that lesson so deeply that by the time I left for college, I already understood my role. I wasn't the daughter they worried about. I was the one they relied on. The one who didn't need anything. The one who would step in when things fell apart. At least that's what I told myself. Because admitting that I wanted to be chosen not for what I could provide, but for who I was, felt like wanting something I had no right to ask for. The financial pressure in our house didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as small adjustments. Cheaper groceries. Lights turned off more aggressively. A hesitation before filling the gas tank all the way. My father never complained, but I noticed the way his shoulders sagged when he came home late, the way he stared at invoices longer than necessary. My mother grew sharper, more controlling, as if keeping everything tightly managed might stop it from unraveling completely. Emily was already building her own life, then moving steadily toward marriage and motherhood. Jason was still young enough to be protected from the worst of it. That left me, old enough to understand, invisible enough to carry it. I didn't tell anyone when I decided what my future would look like. There was no dramatic announcement, no family meeting. I simply adjusted my goals. I stopped thinking about what I wanted to study and focused instead on what would pay. Stability became the dream. Security became the ambition. I applied for scholarships, obsessively worked weekends, took extra shifts whenever I could. I learned how to stretch money before I ever had any. College was the first place where my competence felt like an asset instead of an obligation. I earned a full scholarship to a state university, and for a brief moment I thought that might change how my family saw me. My father was proud, quietly, sincerely. My mother acknowledged it with a nod and a reminder that success came with responsibility. Emily congratulated me distractedly, already juggling wedding plans. Jason joked that I'd be rich someday and could buy him a better car. I laughed with him. I didn't realize how prophetic that joke would become. During my second year, I picked up tutoring on the side. By my third year, I landed an internship at a small financial services firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid. And that was when the phone calls started. At first, they were framed as temporary emergencies. My father's truck needed repairs. A medical copay hadn't been expected. I sent the money without thinking, proud that I could help. Proud that I was useful. Each transfer felt like proof that my plan was working. But the calls didn't stop. They spaced themselves out just enough to feel reasonable. Just enough that I never questioned the pattern forming beneath them. I told myself it was what family did. I told myself it would ease once I graduated. I told myself I was lucky to be in a position to help at all. By senior year, nearly half of what I earned was going home. I worked longer hours. I skipped trips with friends. I lived cheaply without ever feeling deprived because I believed it had a purpose. I was investing in my family. I was buying peace. I was securing my place. What I didn't see then was how easily my help became expected, how quickly gratitude turned into assumption. When I hesitated once, just once, about sending money for something that wasn't urgent, my mother's tone changed. "You know we're counting on you," she said. "You're the responsible one." Responsible. That word followed me everywhere. After graduation, when I accepted my first full-time role as a budget analyst, the relief I expected never came. The requests didn't slow down. They multiplied. Now there were bigger needs, bigger gaps, bigger justifications. And because I had built my identity around being the one who handled things, I didn't know how to say no without feeling like I was failing at the only role I'd ever been good at. I told myself I was strong, that I could handle it, that this was temporary. I didn't yet understand that temporary arrangements have a way of becoming permanent, especially when they benefit everyone but the person carrying them. Once I started working full-time, the boundaries I thought existed disappeared almost overnight. My salary wasn't extravagant, but it was steady, and in my family, steady meant available. The requests no longer came with hesitation. They came with confidence, as if my support had already been factored into the household budget. A late mortgage payment, a utility bill that had slipped through the cracks, insurance premiums that couldn't wait another month. Each call landed softly wrapped in familiarity, and I answered every one of them. I moved into a small studio apartment not far from the office. It was clean, functional, and temporary, at least. That's what I told myself. I didn't decorate much. I didn't buy new furniture. I drove an aging car that rattled when it idled. None of it felt like sacrifice at the time. It felt like discipline. I was doing what needed to be done. Emily benefited without ever asking directly. Her children needed school supplies. There was always an unexpected expense attached to raising a family, and somehow it found its way to me. Jason's situation was more direct. His part-time work never quite covered his needs, and my mother worried aloud about him constantly. "You wouldn't want your brother to struggle, would you?" she asked once, already knowing the answer. I sent the money before she finished the sentence. The pattern became so ingrained that I stopped tracking it consciously. Transfers happened automatically. Extra hours at work felt necessary, not optional. I learned to anticipate requests before they came. I adjusted my spending instinctively, calculating what I could afford to give before I ever considered what I might want for myself. It wasn't that I felt unappreciated. That would have required acknowledgement in the first place. Instead, I felt essential. And being essential can be intoxicating when you've spent most of your life feeling peripheral. I mistook dependence for closeness. I mistook obligation for love. The relationship I was in at the time began to strain under the weight of it all. I was distracted, tired, always checking my phone. Marcus tried to be patient, but eventually his frustration surfaced. "You're always solving someone else's crisis," he said one night. "There's never room for us." I accused him of being selfish. I told him he didn't understand what family meant. He didn't argue. He just looked tired. When he left, I told myself it was for the best. That I didn't have time for relationships anyway. That stability came first. I didn't recognize how neatly that reasoning fit into the role I'd been playing all along. At work, I excelled. I was reliable, detail-oriented, calm under pressure. The very traits that made me indispensable at home were rewarded professionally. Promotions came. Raises followed. And with each increase, my family's expectations grew quietly alongside my paycheck. I noticed how my mother spoke about money when it came from me versus when it came from anywhere else. When bills were covered by my transfers, they were handled without commentary. When money was tight without my involvement, the anxiety was visible, vocal, almost performative. I became the buffer between discomfort and relief. Sometimes late at night, I wondered what would happen if I stopped. The thought made my chest tighten. Who would they turn to? What would break? And beneath those questions was a deeper fear I didn't want to name. If I wasn't useful, would I still matter? So I kept going. I kept giving. I kept telling myself that this was what love looked like in practice, that endurance was proof of loyalty, that one day it would even out. I didn't yet understand that the longer you hold a structure together by yourself, the more everyone forgets it was ever at risk of falling apart. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was already running late for work. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket just as I was locking my apartment door. It was my mother. She never called that early unless something was wrong. I answered without hesitation, already bracing myself. "Your father collapsed at work," she said. "Chest pains. They're taking him to St. Luke's." The rest of her words blurred together. Ambulance, emergency room, tests, waiting. I turned the key back in the lock and sat down on the floor, my back against the door, trying to slow my breathing. By the time I drove to the hospital, the decisions had already begun forming in my head. I didn't yet know the diagnosis, but I knew what it would cost. Blocked arteries, surgery as soon as possible. The doctor explained it calmly, clinically, as if he were describing a routine procedure. My mother nodded through it, all her hands folded tightly in her lap. My father looked smaller in the hospital bed, pale and suddenly fragile. I squeezed his hand and told him everything would be fine, and in my mind that meant one thing: I would handle it. Insurance covered part of the cost. Not enough. The remaining balance was more than my savings, but not by much. I emptied the account without telling anyone. When that wasn't sufficient, I took out a personal loan. The paperwork felt familiar. Numbers I could manage. This was what I was good at. During my father's recovery, I drove home every weekend. I brought groceries, I cooked, I cleaned, I listened. My mother spoke in exhausted fragments, alternating between gratitude and quiet resentment. She never asked directly how I was paying for everything. She didn't have to. The assumption sat between us, unspoken and heavy. It was during one of those weekends that she mentioned his upcoming birthday. 63. After everything this year, she said he deserved something nice, but money was tight. The way she said it wasn't a request, it was an opening. I told her not to worry. I would take care of it. Planning the dinner became a project, something concrete to focus on, while everything else felt precarious. I researched restaurants, read reviews, called ahead. I chose a place downtown that my father had always wanted to try, but never thought was practical. It wasn't extravagant, but it was special. Private enough. Calm. I made the reservation for the whole family and gave them my credit card information in advance. I asked the staff to handle the bill discreetly. I didn't want money to be the topic of the night. When I told my mother I'd covered everything, her response was brief. "That's generous," she said. Her tone was flat, almost guarded. I told myself she was tired, that the year had been hard on her too. Looking back, I recognize the moment for what it was, the beginning of a shift I didn't yet understand. The night of the dinner, I arrived early. I wanted everything to be right. The table was set perfectly. The lighting was warm. I ordered my father's favorite wine without checking the price. It felt important that he enjoy himself, that the year's fear and uncertainty fade even briefly. As I waited for my family to arrive, I sat alone and felt something unfamiliar stir beneath my usual sense of control. A tightness in my chest. A question I couldn't quite articulate. I had done everything right. I had given everything I could. And yet, a part of me wondered quietly, cautiously, whether any of it would ever be enough. My family arrived together as they always did, a small unit moving in sync while I hovered just slightly outside the formation. My father looked better than he had weeks earlier, color back in his face, posture steadier. Seeing that eased something in me. For a moment, it felt worth it. Every transfer, every late night, every quiet compromise. My mother took the seat farthest from mine. I noticed it immediately, the way you notice things you've learned not to comment on. Emily sat beside her, already mid-conversation, her attention split between her phone and her children. Jason slid into a chair across from me, grinning, scanning the menu like the prices were a joke meant for someone else. The restaurant hummed with low conversation and clinking glasses. I suggested wine. My father smiled, pleased. It felt good to give him something he enjoyed without him worrying about the cost. That was the version of the evening I had imagined: simple, warm, grateful. It didn't last. The comments started small, casual enough that anyone listening from the outside might have missed them. When I mentioned a recent project at work, my mother smiled thinly and said it must be nice to have that kind of disposable income. When appetizers arrived and I suggested ordering a few to share, she remarked that some people could afford indulgence more easily than others. Each comment landed softly but precisely, like pressure applied to a bruise. Emily laughed along, distracted. Jason made jokes. No one challenged her. And I told myself not to overreact. This night wasn't about me. It was about my father. I stayed quiet, focused on him, on keeping the mood light. But as the evening went on, the edge sharpened. When Emily reminisced about childhood memories with our father, my mother chimed in about how much patience he'd always had for his eldest. When Jason told a story about getting into trouble as a teenager, she laughed about boys being boys. When I added a memory of my own, something small, something harmless, it was brushed aside, reframed, diminished. "You were always so intense," she said, "always making things more complicated than they needed to be." I felt my shoulders tense. I took a sip of wine and said nothing. The gift exchange came after dinner. Emily and Jason went first. Thoughtful, modest presents. My father was genuinely touched. He didn't need extravagance. He never had. When it was my turn, I hesitated longer than I meant to. The watch felt heavy in my hands, not just in cost, but in what it represented. Still, I handed it to him. His reaction was immediate. Shock. Gratitude. Emotion he didn't try to hide. He tried to refuse it. I insisted gently. Watching him fasten it around his wrist should have been the highlight of the night. Instead, it changed everything. The atmosphere shifted in a way I couldn't ignore. The contrast was too visible. Jason whistled under his breath. Emily stared longer than necessary. And my mother went very still. I saw calculation pass over her face, something hard settling into place. That's when she said it softly, sweetly, that I must have a lot of money to spare, not having a family of my own to worry about. The words weren't loud, but they were deliberate. They reframed my gift as excess, as indulgence, as something separate from love. My father tried to redirect the conversation. He thanked me again. He said how proud he was. But my mother wasn't finished. She'd been building towards something all evening, and I could feel it now pressing forward. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, heart beating harder than it should have. I had planned every detail of that night to avoid discomfort, to keep money invisible. And yet it had surfaced anyway, not as generosity, but as accusation. For the first time, I wondered if the problem had never been how much I gave. It was that I existed at all. The rest of the table seemed to fade as my mother leaned back in her chair, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even disappointment. It was something colder, like she'd finally decided to stop pretending. The wine had loosened whatever restraint she'd been holding on to, and the words began to come more freely. She talked about values, about balance, about how life wasn't just about money and promotions. Each comment landed squarely in my direction, though she never used my name. When I suggested dessert, she remarked that some people could afford to indulge because they didn't have real responsibilities. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, but I kept my posture straight. My voice even. I told myself not to engage. This wasn't the place. Jason laughed, thinking it was harmless. Emily avoided my eyes. My father shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension, but unsure how to interrupt it without making things worse. I watched him carefully, wondering if he saw what I was seeing, or if he'd learned, like the rest of them, to look past it. The moment stretched. And then my mother turned to me directly. She said she'd always worried about how I handled money, that I kept track of things too closely, that I had a way of making people feel indebted without saying it outright. I stared at her, stunned by the precision of the accusation. 6 years of silent transfers, of no questions asked, of covering gaps without comment, and this was how she framed it. I tried to respond calmly. I said I'd only ever wanted to help, that I'd never expected anything in return. She smiled, slow and sharp. "Help," she repeated, as if tasting the word. Or control. Something inside me shifted then. Not all at once, more like a structure giving way after too much pressure. I felt my hands begin to tremble under the table. My chest tightened. The noise of the restaurant dulled until her voice was the only thing I could hear. She spoke about my career, about my independence, about how easy it must be to throw money around when you don't have a husband or children relying on you. Each word reduced me, flattened my life into something selfish and incomplete. I glanced at my father, hoping unreasonably for him to stop her. He opened his mouth, closed it again. I reminded her quietly that I worked long hours, that nothing I had came easily. She waved it off. Success isn't everything, Rachel. There are more important things than numbers. And then she said it. You sit there acting like you're one of us, but you're not really part of this family. The words landed with a weight that knocked the breath from my lungs. Not shouted, not whispered, stated, as if she were correcting a misunderstanding. The table went silent. Even the clatter of dishes from nearby tables seemed to pause. I stared at her, trying to process what she'd said. This wasn't a slip. It wasn't anger. It was a truth she'd decided to speak aloud. I felt something crack open inside me, years of effort, of loyalty, of trying to earn a place that apparently had never been mine. Emily's face drained of color. Jason stopped smiling. My father looked as if he'd been struck. My mother, meanwhile, looked almost relieved. I thought about the nights I'd stayed up running numbers, the weekends I'd driven home instead of living my own life, the savings account I'd emptied without hesitation, and I realized something with sudden clarity: none of it had bought me belonging. It had only delayed this moment. The silence stretched. My heart pounded. I felt anger rising, sharp and hot, but beneath it was something steadier, something calm. For the first time, I wasn't scrambling to fix what was breaking. I was seeing it clearly. And in that clarity, I understood that whatever came next would change everything. For a few seconds after my mother's words, no one moved. It felt as though the air itself had thickened, pressing down on the table, on my chest, on my thoughts. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and loud, like it was counting something down. I had expected anger to come first. Tears. A desperate need to defend myself. Instead, what rose up was something colder and clearer than anything I'd ever felt. I reached for my wine glass with a hand that surprised me by how steady it was. The movement drew my mother's attention. I saw confusion flicker across her face, as if she'd expected me to break, to argue, to apologize. I lifted the glass slightly, not in a toast but as punctuation. Then I spoke. "Perfect," I said calmly. "Then don't ask me for money anymore." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They fell into the silence and spread outward, touching every person at the table. My mother's expression changed instantly. The satisfaction she'd been wearing evaporated, replaced by something sharp and urgent. Fear, I realized. Real fear. For the first time all evening, she understood the cost of what she'd said. "Rachel," she started, her voice suddenly softer. But I raised my free hand, stopping her. "No," I continued, my voice still even. "You're right. If I'm not part of this family, then I don't have obligations here." I took a slow sip of wine, letting the moment settle. My father finally found his voice, calling my name, telling me my mother didn't mean it, that this wasn't what she wanted. But I wasn't looking at him. I was watching her. "Didn't you mean it?" I asked gently. "Because it sounded like you've been thinking it for a long time." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. No words came out. I felt something inside me unlock, years of restraint releasing without turning into chaos. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply stated facts. "If I'm not family," I said, "then I should probably stop paying for things like dinners, mortgage payments, medical bills, emergency repairs." I watched as Emily's eyes widened. Jason's smile disappeared entirely. For the first time, they weren't insulated from the reality of my role. "I should probably stop answering calls late at night when someone needs help," I continued. "Stop rearranging my life to keep everyone else afloat. Maybe I should start living the way you think I already do." My mother leaned forward, her composure cracking. "Please." She said it quietly, desperately. But it was too late for bargaining. I'd spent years negotiating my worth without realizing it. The server approached cautiously, sensing the shift. I turned to him and asked politely to remove my card from the table. His eyes flicked to my family, then back to me. I clarified that I'd pay only for myself. The rest they could split. The effect was immediate. Panic rippled through the table. Emily whispered something to Jason. My father stared at the bill as if seeing it for the first time. My mother's face went pale. "Don't be dramatic," she said, but the authority was gone from her voice. "We can talk about this later." I stood smoothing my jacket. "This isn't drama," I said. "This is clarity." I placed cash on the table for my portion and a generous tip. The weight lifted from my shoulders was almost dizzying. I looked at my father, pain flickering through the resolve. I wished him a happy birthday. I told him I loved him. And then I stepped away from the table. As I walked toward the exit, I felt eyes on my back, confused, angry, frightened. The door closed behind me with a soft finality. Outside, the night air was cool and steady. I inhaled deeply, my hands trembling now that I was alone. For the first time in years, I wasn't holding anything together, and nothing had fallen apart. The drive home felt unreal, like I was moving through a city I didn't quite recognize. Traffic lights blurred, street signs passed without registering. I kept waiting for the familiar wave of guilt to crash over me, the instinct to turn back, to apologize, to smooth everything over the way I always had. It never came. What settled in its place was something quieter. Relief. Heavy, steady relief. My phone started ringing before I reached my apartment. I didn't answer. I didn't need to see the names to know who it was. I let the calls roll to voicemail and focused on the road, on the simple act of getting myself home. Inside my studio, everything looked exactly the same. The couch I'd bought secondhand, the small table by the window, the lamp that flickered when it warmed up. Nothing had changed. And yet the space felt different, lighter somehow, like it belonged to me for the first time. I poured a glass of water and sat down, my hands finally beginning to shake now that the adrenaline was fading. When I checked my phone, there were already several messages. My father's came first. His voice was strained, pleading, confused. He said my mother was upset that she hadn't meant what she'd said, that families said things they didn't mean when emotions ran high. He asked me to call him back. Emily's message followed. She sounded nervous, careful. She said things had gotten out of hand, that Mom was wrong, but this didn't have to become something permanent. Jason's voicemail was shorter, more panicked. He joked awkwardly at first, then dropped it. He said we were family, that I couldn't just walk away. I listened to each message once. Then I set the phone face down on the table. The next morning, the calls continued. My mother didn't leave a message at first. When she finally did, it wasn't an apology. It was a question. What are we supposed to do now? The phrasing landed exactly the way it always had, not about how I felt, not about what she'd said, but about the absence of what I provided. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated itself. Panic gave way to negotiation. Negotiation shifted into guilt. My father called twice a day. Emily sent long texts trying to smooth things over. Jason alternated between humor and desperation. And my mother went quiet again, as if withholding herself might force me to come back and fix it. I didn't. Instead, I slept. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking to check my phone. At work, my focus sharpened. I finished projects early. My manager noticed. She commented on my energy, my clarity. I didn't tell her what had changed. I just nodded and kept going. A week later, I booked a trip I'd been postponing for years. Nothing extravagant, just time away. Time that belonged to me. The decision felt radical, even reckless, and yet entirely reasonable. I didn't ask permission. I didn't explain it to anyone. I simply did it. The absence of constant crisis created space I didn't know how to fill at first. There were moments when the silence felt too loud. Moments when I wondered if I'd been too harsh, too final. But then I remembered the table. The words. the certainty in my mother's voice when she told me I didn't belong. Clarity has a way of returning when doubt creeps in. A month later, the consequences began to surface. My father called about the mortgage. Emily asked if I could help just this once. Jason admitted he was behind on rent. Each conversation felt eerily familiar except for one crucial difference: I no longer felt responsible for the outcome. I listened, I sympathized, and I said no. Not angrily, not defensively, just no. And with every refusal, something inside me settled further into place. I wasn't punishing them. I was stepping out of a role that had never been sustainable, a role that had cost me years of my life. For the first time, my absence forced everyone else to see the structure I'd been holding up alone. And whether they liked it or not, they were finally standing without me. Time didn't fix everything. It exposed it. Without my money cushioning every mistake, my family was forced to confront realities they had avoided for years. Bills didn't disappear just because no one wanted to talk about them. Problems couldn't be postponed with a phone call and a quiet transfer. And slowly, painfully, each of them had to adjust. My father was the first to change. His calls shifted in tone, not pleading, not strategic, just tired. He started picking up small consulting jobs where he could work that didn't strain his recovery, but gave him back a sense of agency. When he spoke about money now, there was less expectation in his voice, more awareness. Emily struggled in ways she'd never had to before. With 2 kids and a tightly balanced household budget, she was forced to look closely at her spending. For the first time, she asked questions instead of assuming I'd fill the gap. Our conversations grew awkward, then honest. She admitted she hadn't realized how much I'd been covering, how easy it had been to accept help without seeing the cost. Jason hit bottom fastest. Without my support, the instability he'd been insulated from caught up with him. He lost his apartment and slept on friends' couches for a while. When he called me then, there was no joking, no charm, just a quiet admission that he needed to change. And this time, I didn't rescue him. I listened. I encouraged. I let him face the consequences of his own choices. The hardest silence came from my mother. Weeks passed without a word. No apologies. No explanations. And then, unexpectedly, a letter arrived. Handwritten. 5 pages long. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on my kitchen counter unread for days. When I finally did, I read it slowly. She wrote about therapy, about resentment she hadn't understood until it was too late, about how my independence and competence had made her feel small, unnecessary, exposed. She admitted that instead of being proud of the woman I'd become, she'd punished me for it. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She said she didn't deserve it. She said she only wanted me to know that she understood now. Understanding, I realized, didn't erase the damage, but it mattered. I responded briefly. I thanked her for the letter. I told her I needed time. I told her that if we were going to have a relationship again, it would have to be different without money at the center of it. Months later, my father called with news I'd both expected and feared. My mother had suffered a mild heart attack. She was stable, recovering. I drove to the hospital that evening, my first visit home since the dinner. She looked smaller in the bed, quieter. When she saw me, she didn't cry. She didn't defend herself. She just said my name. We talked carefully. About health. About boundaries. About what came next. Before I left, she took my hand and said something she'd never said before. "You were always the heart of this family," she said. I just didn't know how to live with that. A year after my father's birthday, we returned to the same restaurant. This time, everyone paid their share. This time, I wasn't managing anything. I was just there. And when we raised our glasses, I understood something clearly, finally. Belonging isn't something you earn by sacrificing yourself. It's something that exists only when you're allowed to be whole.